Hi, how are you? Today, let's discuss what is the difference, or to be precise, distinction between aesthetics and art. The reason I say this is because many people think that aesthetics and art are the same thing, or that the field of aesthetics includes the idea of art. No, they are not the same thing, but they do have a close relationship. So let's discuss whether and where the two notions diverge. Understanding the distinction between the correct settings of these concepts is important because there has been a mix up over their descriptions from the time when Alexander Baumgarten claimed the term aesthetic in the mid 18th century to denote the study of taste according to the senses. And then the difference was further muddled by a long practice of misinterpreting Kant's analytic of the beautiful as relating to art rather than purely to aesthetics. But we can make out the difference clearly. Aesthetics is the quality of perceptions of the senses experiences, while art is the historical tradition of making beautiful objects, writing beautiful things. Some may contend that these are coextensive pursuits, but no, we will see in a while that they are not. In this video, I will discuss that aesthetic properties are neither essential nor adequate for art. We'll also try and address some issues that may arise in your mind. Let's start with making the distinction between the two by explaining the difference between aesthetic and artistic properties. So, broadly speaking, to keep it simple, aesthetic properties are those that are the properties of sensory taste and which we perceive in the things we experience. Properties like delightful, vibrant, mesmerizing, captivating, elegant, all of these. French Sibley was fond of registering aesthetic properties and distinguishes them as not merely perceptual properties but as reliant on perceptual properties, which means that you need taste to perceive them. And you have to avoid discovery by means of what he called condition governedness. That is, being reducible to inherent physical properties. Simple. On the other hand, artistic properties are those that are pertinent to artworks. For example, details about the perspective of creation, who the artist was, when they made the work, what their objectives for the work were, what were the surroundings, what was the political or cultural context, all of that. Despite this difference, which I hope you by now understand, some people argue that art is nevertheless defined by aesthetics. But let me tell you, there are various reasons to refuse to accept this inference. Let's see how. Look, instinctively we utilize aesthetic terms to describe nature. For example, we call a moonlit night mesmerizing, a valley beautiful, a mountain imposing, a tree elegant. However, we don't, in so doing, think of nature as a literal work of art. We don't. On the contrary, much art, especially of the postmodern era, is not principally bothered about possessing a superior aesthetic quality. For example, Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain, or in the case of conceptual art, so they are not much bothered about having any aesthetic properties at all, lacking a physical object to support aesthetic judgment as in the case of conceptual art. And then I can cite a number of pieces of abstract art as examples, but I think the point is well made. Now, in addition to that, you can see, and easily so, that there are numerous fields that don't typically include artworks. Some of these fields are not about artifacts at all, defined entirely by non art objects. So, a few of these aesthetics include the aesthetic of design, the aesthetics of nature, the aesthetics of everyday life, the aesthetics of our sense of touch, the aesthetics of our sense of proprioception, the aesthetics of the experience of scratching an itch. We have all experienced that. The aesthetics of experimenting with eating unusual food, the novelty of the food, the aesthetics of the microscopic and the cosmically gigantic. You see something very small, it has an aesthetic, you're amused. Something huge, way beyond what you expect, it appeals to your senses, your aesthetics. You can now clearly see how vast is the scope of things that can be approximated aesthetically. Now, many of you will argue that all perceptual objects have aesthetic properties, don't they? Look, that simply means, except if we want to expand the scope of art to encompass all perceptual objects, then there is evidently a distinction to be carved between the definition and examination of art and the definition and examination of aesthetics. Let me help you understand. Take the example of forgery. So you can have forged copies of antiques, of art masterpieces that look exactly like the original. So if art really were exclusively related to the aesthetic properties of works, and if those properties depended exclusively on the physical properties of the work, not the context who made it like we discussed, then a perfect imitation of, let's say, a Mona Lisa should be as artistically important as the original. Is that the case? That's not the case. So I hope this example shows why the conflation of art and aesthetics is untenable. In art, context plays a bigger part in establishing aesthetic properties than one might at first think. Here, you can argue that I am being unmindful of the history of art and its enduring occupation with making beautiful objects. You can also ask, how do we explain the fact that so many artists have been inspired to make beautiful objects? Well, that's a legitimate objection. It is true that many objects in art are beautiful and are deeply connected with the aesthetic. However, mind you, concentrating solely on the loveliness of artworks has been termed a kind of archaic myopia by many. And I agree. The conceptual artist Joseph Kossuth said it is necessary to separate aesthetics from art because aesthetics deals with opinions on perception of the world in general. And then he says formalist painting and sculpture can be granted an art condition, but only by virtue of their presentation in terms of their art idea. Kossuth's words by no means form a definitive view on the argument, but this view has been constantly gaining currency in the art world since Duchamp or even earlier. What drives the distinction between aesthetic and art is that making art is about something other than a preoccupation with aesthetic. And this is true, even though conventionally an aesthetic bias has been garnered into art practice. So there may be some overlap, but that's about it. Because despite the overlap it creates, it is clear that the two remain rationally distinct. You can also argue that it is difficult to define with clarity just which properties are artistic ones rather than aesthetic ones, and whether some artistic properties can do double duty. They can be both aesthetic and artistic. And similarly, it's difficult to determine just which properties are purely aesthetic. And then, as an aside, another question that you can ask is what then is the difference between aesthetic properties and sensory properties? For example, aesthetic response to the joy is felt by entering a warm jacuzzi or the wonder one feels watching the sun rise. I am citing these examples of questions because some of the questions objections because my this discussion or video follows from a discussion or some questions I was asked in the midst of a discussion or a forum a few days ago, and I thought that the same questions might arise in your minds. But anyway, let's leave the distinction between aesthetic properties and sensory properties for another discussion. But regarding the distinction between aesthetic and artistic properties, let's take the example of fine literature and poetry, and this should help you understand. Books as physical objects can have aesthetic properties, but because of the abstract nature of the content of a book, they offer nothing for our taste to perceive in a way that is aptly similar to how we perceive aesthetic properties of physical objects. It is a purely artistic experience. For example, you have a beautifully binded, decorated, elegant book on one hand, which contains gibberish or some very low level, unintellectual poetry, and you have a rundown, torn, dilapidated copy of a compilation of Hafiz's poetry, for example, or Shakespeare, which one will appeal to your senses? So it's a purely artistic experience, nothing to do with aesthetics. So I hope this helps you understand that even though aesthetics and arts are related in that aesthetic provides a basis for understanding and evaluating art, it's by now clear that aesthetics and arts are two concepts that pick out different things. Let me sum it up for you. Aesthetics is concerned with the nature of beauty and taste. It is concerned with the relationship between the work of art and the audience and how aesthetic experiences are created and communicated. Art. Art, on the other hand, is a field of creative expression that encompasses a wide array of actual creative work produced by artists. A copy of Mona Lisa has no semblance to the real value of Mona Lisa, for example. Then an ugly looking book of Shakespeare has no comparison with a beautiful book that is of no intellectual merit. So art can be appreciated beyond aesthetics for its context, its intellectual merit, its emotional tapestry, or its social significance. Aesthetics can be appreciated, like we talked about nature, mountains, or even nurtured without art. The two are neither coextensive nor similar. So I hope you understand it by now. It followed impromptu from a discussion I was having in the midst of a forum a few days ago, and some of the very intelligent, pertinent questions or expressions of doubts that were proffered. So thank you very much. Enjoy yourself and see you next time.